All right, everybody. I actually got started a little bit early. I have started a new series. I am going to be switching things up and I will be attempt at streaming regularly on Mondays, where I will be reviewing videos and doing everything sort of meta ethics related, I guess. This is part of an effort to return to the consistency that I had started with back last year when I had started the channel. And also, I want to sort of do a bit to sort of get the meta ethics stuff out of my system. So, big interest of mine is basically, my whole thing is a lot of people critique moral anti-realism in ways where they, from my point of view, represent it in ways that are inaccurate or misleading, or they mischaracterize it in ways that imply the anti-realists are bad people, or that the position is ridiculous or radical or out of accord with common sense. And even many anti-realists, especially academic anti-realists, seem to concede at least some of that ground. They will say that their position bites the bullet here and there. They will say that the position is counterintuitive, all that sort of stuff. I don't like that because I don't agree with it. I don't think that it's true. And I don't like when people depict someone that takes a stance on an abstract philosophical issue that has virtually no practical relevance. When they depict that person as like evil or monstrous for holding an abstract philosophical view that has almost nothing to do with their attitude or behavior or character. And a lot of critics will pay some sort of nominal lip service to saying, oh, well, of course, anti-realists act just like realists. But often this is done in a way where they say, but they're acting like realists when they do that. So really, it's a performative contradiction. And so you present the anti-realists with a kind of dilemma that either they're monsters and psychopaths and evil people, or actually they're just acting like realists and they're contradictory and they don't really live by their principles. And they're both false and not very nice ways of characterizing anti-realists, to say the least. It's bad enough to say that someone like me, in virtue of like my views on philosophical issues that have, again, I don't think any practical relevance, that makes me a psychopath or evil or a monster or a terrible person. It's also insulting and, again, not true to say that I live like a realist. So that stuff really animates me. It really pisses me off. And I got to get it out of my system. So I'm going to do that on Mondays. And I hopefully a lot of the rest of the channel starts orienting around a bunch of other topics. A big focus of mine more recently are all these problems you see in academia with peer review and people faking data. Maybe you saw that recent one with one of the journals, I think Frontiers, that published the stuff with the mice where it was like, it created, I don't know, but if it was like ChatGPT or Midjourney or something, but absolutely ridiculous and obviously fake images. And, that shows concerns about the rise of AI and how that might influence academia. Of course, its repercussions are far more expansive than that. But also it shows problems in peer review and with, editors. The editor didn't look. The people that submitted these images didn't look and didn't think they were going to get caught. Maybe they didn't think they were going to get caught because usually people that do this kind of thing don't get caught. The reviewers, wasn't this peer reviewed? How did they not catch it? And so a lot of like pro science people will be really, really gung ho about how wonderful and amazing and awesome the peer review process is. And I don't think so. I don't think that it is. I think that there are serious problems with the peer review process. So that does not mean that I think scientists shouldn't check the work of other scientists, or academics shouldn't check the work of other academics, or we shouldn't have experts reviewing other people's work. One of the most common misconceptions people have is that when you're critical of a particular version of a thing, that you're critical of the idea of the thing as a whole. You could criticize how someone's doing something. You could criticize their means rather than their ends. And so the end of, hey, we should have this filter process to sort good research from bad research. And a good way to do that is to have people that understand the research look at it and say, yeah, this stuff is good. And that stuff over there is a bunch of crap. Throw it out. That's a great idea in principle. The problem is, how to implement that effectively. And I think that the peer review system has all sorts of huge problems. A big one is just saddling it and grafting it on to this academic publishing industry that is all, their goal is to publish stuff that's going to, look, I don't want to get too into the details about it, but publishers don't have strong incentives to publish research because it's high quality. They have incentives to publish research that will get them notoriety, status, prestige, that sort of thing. And so the people managing, at least at the top, it doesn't mean, of course, that you don't have editors that are deeply dedicated to good research being done. But this stuff is underwritten, funded, and driven by incentives that are fundamentally misaligned with doing good research. And on top of that, it's not like academia and institutions are totally innocent in this. They themselves have set up metrics for evaluating people in terms of status, prestige, career advancement, grants, all that stuff. How do they get it? Publish in top journals, right? You got to publish in those high status journals. And so what this does is it creates an incentive to focus on publish, article. And there's a lot less incentive to other sorts of ways. So that, I want to, and I've contacted a few people. I'll be bringing a few people on to talk about, publication, peer review, that sort of thing. I've talked to Nick Brown, so check that video out. But yeah, I want to talk about this other stuff. And I feel like this will, shifting things to this like regular Monday to get it out of my system will really help me spend a lot of the rest of the time focusing on other stuff. Now, a couple other announcements. And also this, I think I'll do as a more casual chill thing. Today, I'm going to be reviewing a video and I'll get to that. I did post it was my shortest video ever, that 2 minutes. So in the last week, I posted my longest video ever, which was with Nora Belrose on AI optimism. So go check that out. I think it hit a little past 4 minutes and 3 seconds. It's really long. So check that out. And my shortest video, which is about 2 minutes. I will be talking to Joe Schmidt from Majesty of Reason. If you don't know Joe, Joe is a PhD student and does philosophy of religion and a few other things, has a fantastic YouTube channel, and is just really good at comprehensively and at covering topics really just very effectively. And it's just all around a great person, a great researcher. And, go check that channel out. So I'm going to be talking to Joe about what the process of applying and then being a graduate student in philosophy is like, because Joe has just become a PhD student. And so this hopefully will give some practical advice to viewers that may be considering a career in philosophy. And, I don't know exactly what Joe will say, so we'll see. I can be pretty critical. I mean, I went through a master's in philosophy. And so I'm not I don't think nobody should do it or that it's a bad idea, but I do think that it's challenging, and people that are considering it should be aware of the challenges that they're likely to face. So that's what we're going to be talking about. So go check out that video, because what I want people to do for that video is to submit questions for that video. I see a bunch of comments, so let me start saying hi to people. We have Sapir here. Hey, what's up? We have Diddy here. How's it going? I think that someone just gave me my first monetization. Sapir, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, so I am now monetized on the channel. I have it set up so that I'm not running ads on anything. I don't like ads. I've never liked getting them. That doesn't mean I don't like having to deal with them. So that might be something that I change in the future, especially as the channel grows and I gauge interest from viewers. I know Danny over at Field Talk, a lot of people over there were pretty supportive of running ads. So maybe that'll turn out to be fine. I never even considered, because the channel has been so small for so long, like sponsorships. I don't know. This is just occurring to me now. What do you think of sponsors? Is that okay? Would Audible be cool? That seems connected to this channel. I don't know. Possible, I would be open to doing something like that. Whatever. We have Mr. X here saying, but yeah, if you would be okay with that, let me know. I've never really considered that. I usually see really specific stuff on the channels that I watch that are sponsors for these sorts of things. But yeah, I don't know. I keep saying I don't know. What I'm trying to get across is these are things I'm actually thinking of on the fly. And I don't have any opposition or I would prefer to just get on here and talk. That's my thing. I don't like overly formal stuff, and I don't like saying, "Hey, hold on, let's talk about this product." I don't like that idea. But yeah, anyway, what do you think? Nitty here says, if you want a guest on this, I'd love to be a layperson talking about it, how it goes with YouTube content. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, so when I bring people up to the channel, occasionally I do that. You're welcome to come up here and talk. All right. Already people jumping into the topic. Jude Lind, how's it going? Says atheism doesn't imply nihilism, but there's also nothing wrong with nihilism, in my view, at least. All right, let's see. Got more people saying hello. Hi. Sapir says it was 4 hours, not 4 minutes. I think what I was trying to say is that the talk on AI was 4 hours and I think 3 minutes. So it was hours and minutes. Nitty proves a Joe for Majesty Reason. Joe is fire. All right. And also says, give Phil Talk all your monies. Okay. So Phil Talk, that's Danny over in Phil Talk. So Danny has been on TikTok a lot, basically doing a live stream, and then people can sort of come up on the stage, almost like a call-in show, and argues a lot about the problem of evil and about the Trinity and that sort of stuff. Most of the stuff I've seen recently is the problem of evil. Oh, I hit 1,000 followers on TikTok. So now I could do that too. I haven't done it yet. It's been a whole week since I hit 1,000. And so I could go on there and do it. I still got to figure out how to do that to where it's on TikTok and then it comes over to YouTube too. So it's in both places. But now you have TikTok. I don't know what's going to happen. If TikTok's going to not, is it going to be here in a few months? I don't know. All right. That covers everybody there. And let's see. Is there anything else I wanted to go over? I feel like there was something else I wanted to mention and I already forgot what it was. But right. So for that little video I posted, in fact, let me just post it here. I'll just post it in the chat. And if you have questions about graduate school, and it could also be questions about publication and that sort of stuff for Joe, I mean, I may give input. I probably will give input on some of the stuff if I have something to say about it. But really, I want to hear what Joe has to say, because I already know what I have to think. Sorry, I already know what I think or what I have to say. And, Joe probably will have more useful insights. Okay, where is the video? Here it is. Yeah, it was 2 minutes and 7 seconds. There it is. All right, so go check that out and submit questions if you have them. You only have a couple more days to do that, because I think I'm going to close it out Wednesday and get all those questions ready. We're also just going to be talking, I think, about our experience and stuff like that. It's not just going to be a Q&A. Oh, that's the other thing I was going to mention. I've been thinking about doing an AMA, especially because in Kane B's video, that's another channel you should go check out. I'm mentioning all the channels. Kane B does AMAs, like Ask Me Anything sorts of things, and we'll do hours of answering people's questions. And in one of the last videos said that he's tired of doing it. So maybe I'll start doing AMAs. I don't have as broad and expansive a knowledge of philosophy as Kane B, so I won't give as wide and interesting a range of questions. But I'll probably post another short, like maybe 2-3 minute video or something, asking you to do that. Maybe next week, maybe the week after, and then it'll take me some time to go through. And I think I'll probably do it live. I'll sort the questions, but I may read the questions and address them live. But anyway, I'll give the details once I figure out how exactly I'm going to do that. And so I'm probably going to do an AMA. Just to give you a sense of what I'll be asking, though, is there's lots of topics I'm not going to answer any questions. Like if you ask questions about topics I don't like to discuss, or I'm not comfortable discussing, or are too personal, I'm not going to answer this question. So some people are, that was my struggle. I'm like, do I really want to call it an AMA? Because it's not really Ask Me Anything. It's Ask Me like lots of things. I don't even want to say Ask Me Almost Anything. Like is an AMAA. So I'll have to come up with some way of framing it where it's not quite so silly. So, all right. So what are we doing today? So today I am going to be reviewing a video by Thinking Christian. Now, Thinking Christian, he's got a small channel and was a guest on this. I'll post the video here too. So there it is. And I think I could pin that. Yeah, let me go over here. One moment. Let me pin that so you can find the video. But I'll also be sharing my screen so you can see it. What I'm going to be doing today is reviewing this video. And I'm going to be critical, but, Thinking Christian, I thought was very nice, fun person to talk to. And so while I'll be critical of the content of the video, I don't want to come off as being harsh or mean-spirited or anything like that. I do think that there were a lot of concerns I had with the content of the video. I don't know if I finished it. I think I watched most of it. At least I may have finished it. So I think we should just, if anybody doesn't have any comments or anything like that before we get started, then we'll just get started. All right. So let's get started. Let me see if I could share the screen. Oh yeah, we're gonna have to do that thing where I check on. Oh right, how does that look? One moment. Let me check a couple settings. Okay. Now, let's see. So let me play it and then just let me know so I can balance out the audio and make sure that they're.
Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video what I want to do is explain why atheism implies moral nihilism. Now,
How does that sound?
we're going to have to define these terms, especially these moral terms like moral nihilism. But before we even get started with that, I really want to point out and be clear about this. We're not saying that atheists can't do things we consider to be good. And I realize there are probably some theists out there who use a similar argument to try to say atheism.
All right. Anyone else? I want to get confirmation from, I guess I'll say 3 people that the audio is good. That's 2 people so far. And if I get a third, then I think we'll be good to go. Oh, that'll be a good standardized rule for me. So, if 3 people confirm the audio, then okay, we got 4. All right, so let's get started. That sounded a little fast to me. Okay, it's on normal speed. All right, let's get going.
Hey everyone, this is Paul, and in this video what I want to do is explain why atheism implies moral nihilism. Now we're going to have to define these terms, especially these moral terms like moral nihilism. But before we even get started with that, I really want to point out and be clear about this. We're not saying that atheists can't do things we consider to be good. And I realize there are probably some theists out there who use a similar argument to try to say atheists can't do moral things. And this is just wrong. I mean, it's just wrong and misguided. I would say it's wrong because I'm friends with some atheists and naturalists, and they're some of the nicest people that I know. So I didn't even think I needed to address this, but there are even many philosophers who miss this point, so I got to point this out. In fact, even many atheists believe this to be true. You can check out this Nature paper that talks about this, but this isn't what we're talking about in this video. Rather, we're talking about something a lot more fundamental.
Okay, so before we get into the rest of the video, there's this common thing where sometimes atheists will interpret Christians who say that, like, you can't have objective morality without God or whatever, saying you can't literally act moral or be a moral person without God existing, without belief in God. So if you're an atheist, then you just can't be a good person. And this is not what Christians that say that, like, moral realism requires God are saying. They're saying that, like, realism couldn't be true unless there was a God, something like that. And yeah, that just has nothing to do with whether someone that believes there is no God can't be a good person. So, what Christians are often quick to say is, of course, you can be a good person, even if you don't believe in God. So that fair enough. And I think that that's a fine thing to point out. And I don't misinterpret this claim that way, but I have seen people do this so frequently that it's become a sort of standard part of the way that apologists discussing metaethics discuss it, to bring this up and say, no, we're not saying you are bad people. So that's fine.
Whether goodness.
So Pierce says, maybe I forget if he gives a definition, but Spear says, so does he just mean moral anti-realism when he says moral nihilism? I don't remember, and I guess we will get to that. So we'll see if there's a definition and if there's clarity on that.
Goodness is a coherent concept or refers to anything that exists at all, and whether atheism has the necessary believe this to be true. You can check out this Nature paper that talks about this, but this isn't what we're talking about in this video. Rather, we're talking about something a lot more fundamental. Whether goodness is a coherent concept or refers to anything that exists at all, and whether atheism has the necessary grounding to promote the truth of any sort of moral beliefs. And that's what we're going to get into. So let's first talk about a few.
No, the truth of moral beliefs, it's not explicit whether it's an objective or stance-independent truth. So, subjectivists and relativists do think that there are moral truths. So just flag that the lack of explicit use of metaethical terminology, which of course it would be really tedious to say objective moral fact or stance-independent moral fact all the time when you're talking about moral truth or moral facts.
What are those theories? I'm going to kind of simplify these a little bit. So this isn't going to be like the most cohesive view, but I want to kind of get down to the bottom of what we mean by moral truth or moral realism. So consider a moral claim like owning human slaves is wrong. The first question we need to ask is whether or not such a claim is truth apt, meaning can this claim be true at all? Is it possible that, owning human slaves is wrong could be a true statement? And if you say no, you're kind of left into this category that's called emotivism. This is
Okay, so a few concerns here. I mean, first, and to be fair, this is a very standard way of approaching questions in metaethics, is to go down what I call this sort of flowchart method, and it typically begins with this question, which is basically the question of, are you a cognitivist or a non-cognitivist? And what that means is, do you think when people make moral claims like owning human slaves is wrong, is that claim a proposition? That is it capable of being true or false? The term sometimes uses, is it truth apt? Or is it just not the sort of thing that's capable of being true or false? And when something is not capable of being true or false, like that structurally looks like the sort of thing that would be an assertion about what's true or false. But there's lots of parts of language where, imperatives, questions, those aren't like, hey, what time is it? That can't be true or false. And a lot of these start with, in the flowchart method, start with that distinction. Now, I really object to this. And the reason I really object to this is something everyone on this channel has heard probably 1,000 times if you watch any of my videos. So I'm not going to dwell on it. We'll point out the issues with this video. And if I've already covered it a million times, I'll do my best to not spend a million times covering it, a million different ways. The issue here is the presumption that the sentence means something. Sentences don't mean anything. Sentences are types of, it's like talking about like, what's the purpose of an instance of a person walking? I don't, where are they walking? Their goals. Walking doesn't have any specific purpose. Walking has a context-dependent purpose. And it's the same thing, on my view, with literally every actual usage of any sentence or utterance or linguistic act of any kind. Its meaning emerges or manifests in its contexts of usage. And so it doesn't make sense to talk about sentences having meanings. It only makes sense you could talk about, it's not like you can only talk about concreta and you can't abstract at all. Of course, we can make statistical composites of how people tend to talk about things, but it's very much similar to like when you say something like the average American family has 1.8 children. There is no actual family with the 1.8 children. That's a statistical composite of averaging over all the Americans. I don't actually know what the real numbers are. I'm just making this up. And it's the same thing with sentences. You could say, okay, well, this type of sentence and anything similar to it, because someone could say possessing human slaves is wrong or owning human slaves is morally wrong. Take that whole cluster of sentences that are really similar and all the instances in which people actually use them, and this would be in the English language. And then you could say, okay, are there statistical facts of what people tend to be attempting to communicate in those cases? And the answer is yeah, of course. There's going to be patterns that emerge from similar instances of linguistic practices. And you could sort of quantify over those and say, here's what people typically mean. Here's the mode. Here's the median. If you can quantify certain elements of what's said, sometimes these are going to be nominal differences that you couldn't quantify. But just the point is, there are going to be these statistical facts about what people are doing in any particular instance. But that doesn't mean that the sentences mean something outside those contexts. It just means that you can aggregate or make inferences about categories of contexts. So you could say, like, most of the time when a person goes to a restaurant, it's because they want to eat, almost, but not always. Sometimes people go to a restaurant, they're not hungry, but they agree to meet somebody. So, restaurants, it would be a mistake to say the only reason anyone ever goes to one is to eat. And it's the same thing with languages. Even if a sentence is, languages, but sentences, utterances, questions, any linguistic practice, just because it's usually like this sort of statement is usually used to communicate one idea or concept or whatever, doesn't mean that it's always used that way. Language is really variable, and this needs to be addressed when people talk about language. So I said I wouldn't dwell on this, but so I won't. But the issue here is this is already starting with a sort of standard analytic approach to addressing metaethics that grounds our metaethical positions in these semantic theses, these theses about the decontextualized meanings of moral sentences. And I just think that's a bad approach. I think it's fundamentally misguided. So we're going to have another problem here, which we'll get to in a second.
once again, it's a little bit of a simplification, but it's kind of like the idea that when somebody says owning human slaves is wrong, all they're basically saying is, I personally don't like it when people own human slaves. And this is very similar to saying when somebody says chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla ice cream, they're basically saying, I like chocolate ice cream. Not that
two mistakes here. So if a person says, I like chocolate ice cream, that's actually a propositional claim, and that would be a better characterization of subjectivism. So between the two flavors, I actually prefer vanilla ice cream over chocolate ice cream. So when I say I like vanilla ice cream, that statement is actually true. I'm telling you about my attitudes, and that's actually a propositional claim. That's not emotivism. Emotivism is characterizing these utterances, something like I like chocolate or I like vanilla ice cream better, or vanilla ice cream is my favorite flavor. It's actually saying, okay, well, that might appear to you to be a proposition. It's actually expressing some sort of emotional attitude, like vanilla ice cream, yum, which of course is not, that can't be true or false. Yum can't be true or false. So there's already a subtle mistake there, which is I like is actually a claim about one's mental states or attitudes, which would be true or false. But I'll wait until this wraps up, and then I'll talk about the other problem with this.
There's any sort of reason for them that they could offer to somebody who likes vanilla ice cream why chocolate ice cream is better. Some other people see this as sort of just when people say slavery is wrong, it's just kind of like saying boo slavery, like a sports fan when they're cheering their team or booing the opposing team. They're not actually providing an argument, trying to kind of, and we'll talk about the manipulation part over. They're just kind of screaming very loudly to, like, or saying it with a lot of emotive force, but no logical force. Now, if you believe that moral claims could have the possibility of being true or false, you're left into this.
Okay, so before we move on to cognitivism, here's an issue with this. Emotivism is not the only type of non-cognitivism. So non-cognitivist views are any views which hold that moral claims are not true fact. Emotivism was a particular view put forward by Ayer, and it's a very old view from the early mid 20th century. It's not a prominent view among non-cognitivists, and these days a lot of them call themselves expressivists. It's kind of like the neo non-cognitivism. And so this is looking like what you would find in an old like intro to ethics textbook. And the thing is, a lot of the intro to 50 years out of date. We've had quasi-realism, we've had universal prescriptivism from Hare, we've had other non-cognitivist accounts around for a long time, decades now. And so this is just really very out of date. Emotivism is like one very crude early form of non-cognitivism, and there's a bunch of others. So another thing about this is just a slight inaccurate. I mean, emotivism is a type of non-cognitivism. But again, you also have, one way that moral claims could be non-cognitive, and that is they don't express propositions, is if they just express emotional states. Another, by the way, that does not mean that moral claims do express propositions, that they don't also express emotional states as well. So the reverse cognitivism is not that they express propositions, but they don't express emotions. That's not part of it. It's that one is that they only express these non-propositional content. And then cognitivism is that they express at least some propositional content, and they could also express non-propositional content. So that's a subtle point, but it's one worth raising. But another way that a non-propositional claim could be made with respect to morality is if it were uttered as an imperative, as an order. And this is another type of non-cognitivism that's not emotivism. You could call it something like prescriptivism. And this would be the view that instead of saying, like taking this example, owning slaves is wrong, emotivism would construe that as owning slaves, boo. Whereas prescriptivism would say owning slaves is wrong would be better construed as something like don't own slaves, something like that. And you see, those are different. Now, maybe you don't see it as a big difference, but it is a difference. And maybe it's not always super important to split hairs here, but you might find one of these. I realize because that's a reference to R.M. Hare that could have been a pun, but that wasn't intentional. It's important just to get the lay of the land accurate. And I feel like there was a subtle inaccuracy here. Okay.
Place called moral cognitivism, which means that moral statements could have cognitive meaning. So the next question we need to ask is whether there are some moral claims that are true. And there are some people that think moral claims have some cognitive meaning, but they're all false. And this is what's called error theory. Basically, somebody who follows error theory would say, if somebody says owning human slaves is wrong, they basically think, okay, that's a statement that has cognitive meaning, but it's a false statement. And likely the other side of the coin too, if somebody says owning human slaves is right, the error theorist would say that's also a false statement. Wait, what? Yes, any sort of moral statement under error theory is false. And that's because the error theorist doesn't believe moral statements can be true. So they're all false. This is like kind of saying any claim you make about unicorns is going to be false, or any sort of first order claim you make about unicorns.
Yeah, this is a very standard example. And it's also good that he included first order here, because it's specifically the claim that first order moral claims cannot be true. Cannot be true. They're all false. And first order would be statements like murder is wrong, lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, but it's not stuff like sentences about whether murder is wrong are always false. That's a second order claim. It's a claim about the first order moral claims. And so error theorists have no problem with there being true abstract or meta or second order moral claims. It's specifically that the first order claims are false. So sometimes people will say, well, we'll just be very confused, and they'll critique error theory. And they're like, wait, well, if you're saying all moral claims are false, that's a moral claim. So isn't that false then? So your claim is self-refuting. This is very silly. It's just a misunderstanding of what error theorists are rejecting. And he accurately characterizes error theory and uses that first order language, which is really important, and gives a very standard example, which is the unicorn example.
Is going to be false because unicorns don't exist. So if somebody was to say, unicorns can fly, that statement is false if there is no such thing as unicorns. Now, someone may object to this and say, well, a unicorn is an object that could fly. So if unicorns exist, then they could fly. But that's not.
A little bit of an awkward example, because we don't typically think of unicorns as flying. So giving them some other sort of mystic ability or whatever. I mean, make your examples a little tighter, I guess. I mean, it's a minor criticism, but
what we're asking, all that's doing is just kind of defining this new term into existence that doesn't have any basis in reality. By definition, of course it can fly, but we're asking whether or not there's a thing out there when we use the word unicorn to refer to that can fly. And if there's nothing that word unicorn can refer to in reality, then it's false that any unicorn can fly or could fly. So that's kind of the part about error theory. Now, if you believe some moral claims are true, the next question we need to ask is whether or not the truth of these moral claims is objective or mind independent. Now, if you answer no to this question, you're basically left with moral relativism. Now, what moral relativism would say is when somebody says owning human slaves is wrong, what they're basically saying is owning human slaves is wrong for me and my society or me and my culture, but it's right in other societies or other possible societies. Whereas if you're a moral realist, which is if you say the truth of some moral claims is objective, they would believe if they.
Yeah, so like emotivism, moral relativism, there's a bunch of different types of moral relativism. You have the distinction between agent and appraiser relativism, the difference between sort of individual subjectivism and cultural relativism. You could technically relativize moral standards to like humanity as a whole versus some alien species or something. So it's just any way that it's any instance in which you index standards to different moral frameworks. That gives you relativism. It doesn't have to be at the cultural level or the individual level. But this is leaving out, basically, the category should be called something like stance-dependent account. So, or in this case, like non-objective account. So any account which is cognitivistic and there are moral facts, it's just that they're not objective facts, those should all be included. And those aren't all relativistic frameworks, because some of them only have one moral standard. This would be, inclusive of what you could call what Joyce references someone. I never know who it is. So I could give the reference if somebody really wants it, but someone else proposed this term, relation designating accounts. So you could have a moral system where moral facts are based on what God's preferences are. And this might be a kind of very crude, stance-dependent, anti-realist form of divine command theory. I'm not saying divine command theory is necessarily an anti-realist one, but if you say there are moral facts and they're made true by God's standards or values, that could give you a type of anti-realism. But note that there's only one set of moral standards. And this is also true of ideal observer theory. And that would say, hey, the moral facts are the facts that a fully informed and ideally rational agent would endorse. You might think that that agent would, there's only one version of that. It's not like me being fully informed, I'd endorse one set of values, and you being fully informed and ideally rational, you'd have a different set of values. No, there's one set of values. But those values are dependent on what that hypothetical agent would favor or prefer or endorse. And so it still stance dependent, but there's one correct set of standards. So it's not relativistic. And so you do have these stance-dependent accounts where there's one correct set of moral standards, so it's just not stance-dependent. Those accounts are not included in relativism. So again, you have kind of this is giving a mostly okay picture, but it's oversimplifying. And some degree of simplification, I think, is fine. So I don't think that emotivism in place of non-cognitivism is a big problem. And I also don't think this is a big problem. This is just me being pedantic and picky, not a big problem.
Thought that this was one of those claims that could track truth. Owning human slaves is wrong could be an objective fact, just the same way 2 + 2 = 4 is. And that's kind of the really important piece. We'll talk about some of the problems with moral relativism and why I don't think this even works in terms of objective truth, because my idea is, how can it be possible that you have truth that's relative to certain cultures? We don't have this idea that, oh yeah, this scientific theory is somehow valid under this culture, but it's not under this other culture.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little strange to say, how could you have truth that's true relative to different cultures? Well, if the truth is the truth about what the culture standards are, what would the issue be? So, if you have, to give an example, in some cultures, the standard practice for the dead is to bury them. In others, the standard practice is to cremate them. And, you could say in one culture, they could say, the right thing to do in our culture is bury the dead. And the other, they could say the right thing to do is to cremate the dead. And that could be true relative to those cultures. Now, you could say that both of those are actually true relative to a single overarching objective moral standard, which is treat the dead with respect. And so maybe you don't like that example, but just the point would be, and especially, maybe they just don't think of it that way. The point would just be that statements about what's good or bad relative to one's culture can actually be set by the standards of that culture in a way that's perfectly coherent. You don't have to think that it's true or actually think that morality is true or false relative to one's culture. But it's a little weird to act like, well, I shouldn't say act like. It's a little weird to treat this as though this is some puzzling and strange feature. To give another example, a lot of the claims that a person would make would just be straightforward descriptive claims about what's true in their culture. So in our culture, this is the common practice. And someone in a different culture would say, in our culture, this is a different practice. These are descriptive claims that are describing the norms, standards, procedures, attitudes, or features of that culture. And two cultures could have different norms, standards, procedures, or practices. And if moral claims are treated like that, if they're treated as descriptive claims about what's true according to one's culture, then there's no semantic, conceptual, or logical problem with those statements. So, if one culture, it is okay to steal, and another culture, it's not okay to steal, and you translate that on the cultural relativist framework, when a person in a culture that thinks it is, in a culture in which it's considered okay in that culture to steal, when that person says it's morally permissible to steal, they're indexing their claim to the standards of their culture. And so that statement can be translated to something like, it is consistent with the standards of our culture to steal. And then that statement is just straightforwardly true. And alternatively, when a person in a culture where it's not okay according to their standards to steal says it's not okay according to our standards to steal, that's also true. Both the statements, so you have these two statements that might look like they contradict one another. It's okay to steal, it's not okay to steal, and they're both true, but they're both true relative to the respective frameworks of the cultures to which they are indexed. This is no different than if I say, and I've given this example before, if I say I am Lance, and you say I am Lance and you're not Lance, the statement's true when I say it and false when you say it. The relativism treats moral claims as having an implicit indexical element such that the statements function just like I, me, you. If you say you are going to the store, that could be true of one person and false of another person. So these statements, what those words do, you, I, we, me, what they do is they refer to specific people or groups of people or whatever. And the truth value of the statement can vary in accordance to who those words are referring to. They're indexed to different people. And so you don't get a logical contradiction or any problem at all with the meaning of those statements. We use these indexicals all the time, every day. I'm using them in the sentences that I'm speaking, like I'm using them. That has an indexical element. It would be very difficult to speak without indexicals. I mean, maybe you could pull it off, but we already do this. And I find it puzzling that people are already deeply saturated in the use of indexical language, but don't seem to appreciate. Relativism is just saying, yeah, moral claims are indexical. They index themselves to the standards of the speaker's culture or the speaker's preferences or something like that. So of course, one person can prefer one thing and another person could prefer something different, and there's no contradiction at all. So I'm puzzled by this. I'm puzzled by why people struggle with this, both because like you could just read what relativists say, and this is already abundantly clear in their characterizations, but also, again, we already speak and think this way all the time. And I'm totally comfortable saying, you know, I'm willing to say something controversial. Every single person listening to this video uses indexical language, and they use it probably every day, and they have no problem with it at all. So just extend that to morality. What's the problem?
My idea is if certain things are true, then they should be true independent of who's thinking about it or their culture or their,
See, it should be true independent of their culture or who's thinking about it. Okay, so if I'm talking about my culture standards, that should be true independent of my culture standards. Doesn't make sense. That actually doesn't make sense because they're making descriptive claims about what's true relative to their cultures. What doesn't make sense about that? Why would is any statement a person makes about anything? What if it's a statement about their preferences? I like strawberry ice cream. That has to be true independent of my preferences. Why would it have to be true independent of my preferences? You know, so, and just the point is, if somebody says strawberry ice cream is delicious, they don't have to say, I think that, in order for that to be implied or implicit in what's being said. So I think a lot of these concerns and problems people have with relativism is excessive semantics, excessive formalization. If they didn't see the I think that there, then suddenly the language is a huge problem. And it's just not. Lots of what's spoken about in language is implicit, or sorry, a lot of what's conveyed or meant in language is not spoken. It's not stated. It's implicit. When do people lose their sensitivity to pragmatics? The very same people that raise these issues in these meta-ethical contexts go out and live their everyday lives. They interpret sarcasm. They see subtext in TV and movies. They can tell when like Tyrion Lannister says one thing but means something else in Game of Thrones. So we're already saturated in a pragmatically rich verbal contexts every single day. We notice these things. So why do people forget this when they're looking at language? It's because I think when people are taught to do this semantic analysis, they decontextualize. They set aside all the pragmatics. They set aside all of what the language is actually doing in real and dissect these inert sentences that exist in this like conceptual Platonic hyperspace where no one's using them for anything. And that's not language. Language is used to do things. It's used for things. It's a type of behavior. So the whole problem here, I think, is this decontextualized semantic analysis as if sentences have meanings and that meaning is not conveyed by the pragmatics. This is just so basically, I think that thinking Christian has just inherited the framework and approach of analytic philosophers, and that framework is bad. And when it's a garbage in, garbage out process where if you employ a bad method, you're going to get bad results. And I think this is actually fostering confusions and misunderstandings about metaethics. In other words, like metaethicists themselves, the analytic philosophers themselves are actually confusing people about metaethics. They're not only not informing them accurately, they're actually decreasing people's understanding about how language works and about how moral language works and about how thinking about these things works. And they're ratcheting them through this system that is based on a fundamentally flawed view about how language works. It's all ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Anyway, I don't want to ramble too much about that.
Where they were born, these sorts of things, but that's kind of a different issue. So moral realism is the claim that some moral claims are true and other ones are.
Sorry, let me stop. Sabir says, do you think there's also a problem with how people think about truth in general? Maybe. I don't know. I kind of doubt it. So I think there's a problem with how philosophers think about truth, but I don't think non-philosophers have this like really empty and vacuous and goofy truth correspondence notion of truth. Maybe, I don't know what view they have of truth, but it may be that it's actually functionally pretty similar to pragmatic notions of truth, which are what I favor. Okay, let's keep
false. Not just all of them are false or they're nonsense. And I would argue, you could say moral anti-realism, or what we'll talk about in a second, moral nihilism, is simply any of these other.
There you go. Let's hear that again. It sounds like nihilism and anti-realism are
moral realism is the claim that some moral claims are true and other ones are false. Not just all of them are false or they're nonsense. And I would argue, you could say moral anti-realism, or what we'll talk about in a second, moral nihilism is.
It sounds like nihilism and anti-realism mean the same thing here. So why use the term nihilism instead of anti-realism? I mean, nihilism sounds worse. I'm a little worried that nihilism was chosen because it sounds bad.
Simply any of these other categories that don't believe that moral claims can be objectively true. So let's talk about a problem with each of these different ones, including moral realism. The first is I'm going to kind of group emotivism and error theory together because they both claim that moral claims cannot be true. The problem with
well, that cannot be true. I don't know that. So maybe in like a different modality. So like emotivists might think it's not even possible for them to be true in principle because they're just not in the business of saying anything true or false. Whereas an error theorist might say they could be true if they did correctly refer to the moral facts, but there aren't moral facts, so they fail to refer. And so they like couldn't be true conditional on the way that the world is. So it's like a different type of possibility claim.
This view is that under these theories is moral discourse simply becomes manipulation. Others are kind of always means to your end, as Alistair McIntyre says. And they both claim that moral.
This is where I think I really started getting upset. So I had that reaction, but I had that reaction last time, and I guess I forgot that pops up so quickly. So check it out. These are going to be framed as forms of manipulation. And I think I really take issue with this.
Claims cannot be true. The problem with this view is that under these theories is moral discourse simply becomes manipulation. Others are kind of always means to your end, as Alistair McIntyre says in After Virtue.
Okay, this is false. This is just not true. It's not just false, it's an extremely objectionable way of characterizing emotivism and error theory. So first of all, this is another example of normative entanglement. There's already an implication here that the emotivist or the error theorist is themselves a sneaky, dirty, evil manipulator. That is totally nonsense. Here's why. First, emotivism and error theory start with descriptive claims about how other people use moral language. If everyone in the world used the word banana to refer to bananas, and your view of language is that like the like common usage fixes the referent, okay, then the word banana refers to bananas. Too bad if you don't like it. And it's the same thing here. These views, they're overly semantically oriented, but if it's in fact true that when people use moral language, they're just expressing their emotions, the emotivist is starting with that observation. They're observing, hey, that's how the language works. That does not make them a dirty, sneaky, evil manipulator. It's just that, yeah, that's how moral language works. It has nothing to do with an indictment of them personally. And I think we're already getting an insinuation here that if you endorse these views, so you have to be a realist to not be a dirty, evil, sneaky manipulator. This is not a good way to frame things. It's not just factually mistaken about the implications of these views. These views do not entail, neither emotivism nor error theory entail that moral language is manipulative when you use it. That's just not true. It's not true in spirit. There may be some technical way in which you could say, well, the function of the language is always to try to get people to do what you want, and so therefore it's manipulative. But if I go to the store and I ask someone, and I say let's say I go to a Starbucks and I say to the barista, hey, I'd like a venti cappuccino. Am I manipulating them? I'm using language to get what I want. So you don't want to have such an inclusive notion of manipulation that literally any language where you're trying to achieve your goals is manipulation, because that makes all goal-oriented language sound bad, and like pretty much all language is goal-oriented. So I'll say more about that. But yeah, what was I going to say about these views? Right. So these are just descriptive views, and they don't have, they began as descriptive views, and they end up making these metaphysical claims and various claims about semantics. And they don't say anything about the specific conduct of the proponent of the view. So it's a little weird to imply that these views are all about manipulation. But let's hear a bit more.
Now, why is this? Well, because we tend to act as if our moral claims are true, and we
act as if our moral claims are true. What does that mean? Act as if they're true objectively, mind independently, stance independently? If that's the implication, what does that mean? How does a person act as if their stance independently true? How would you act differently if they weren't stance independently true? Okay, so let's say I'm an emotivist and I don't like murder. I don't want people to commit murder. I want to stop murders. I have this negative attitude towards murder. That results in, to the extent that that is causally efficacious on my behavior, a particular behavioral profile. If I see someone trying to commit a murder, I'm going to try to stop them, or I'm going to call the police. I'm going to get upset when I hear about murders. I'm going to have this behavioral profile. Then if you're a realist, okay, so now you think it's objectively true that murder is wrong, in addition to having an attitude that it's bad or whatever. Okay, and how does your behavior differ? I think the answer is it doesn't. It doesn't change your behavior. So how do you act as if realism is true? What would a realist do that's different from an anti-realist, other than say things like, I'm a moral realist? So an anti-realist can't sincerely say that they're a realist. What else can a realist do that they can't? Audience, what can an anti-realist not do? What do they do that shows they're realist? A lot of times, realists will say that people act like realism is true. And if you ask them for examples, they're like, well, they judge other people. They make moral claims. They react. Yeah, reacting to things you don't like does not mean you're a realist. If you eat a piece of food and it tastes bad and you go, ugh, this is gross, and you throw it out, does that mean you're acting like a gastronomic realist? Are you acting like it's objectively true that your food has the intrinsic property of grossness? No, I'm sorry, that's fucking ridiculous. Your emotional reactions don't convey your stances on propositions or metaphysics. That's absolutely silly. And so when a person is like, that person committed a murder, that's horrible, a strong reaction or a judgment, or saying people that did that are evil, that has absolutely nothing to do with being a moral realist. Nothing. I'm so sick of realists implying that if you care about things, you're a realist about them. I care about food. I'm not a gastronomic realist. I care about music. I'm not a music realist. I care about the movies I watch. I'm not a cinematic realist. Again, just like the other case of relativism, realists themselves, in many cases, are not realists about like taste preference types things. And they make judgments. They write Yelp reviews. They write a review. I'm going to give this place 4 stars. This place sucked. Are they acting like a gastronomic realist? No, because having judgments and preferences and attitudes and values and caring about things and acting in accordance with them does not mean, and it doesn't imply, that the only way you could think about that or do that or whatever is if you think that there are stance-independent facts with respect to that thing. It does not imply that. It doesn't entail it. It doesn't even imply it. This is so silly. It's why do they say this? People act like, and if this is not saying people act as if there are stance-independent truths, just acting as if they're truths. No, a relativist acts as though there are moral truths because they think there are moral truths. Like they're not acting like a realist. So if this is implying that people act like there are non-realist moral truths, like stance-dependent moral truths, how is that an objection? Because that's consistent with anti-realism. That's not a problem. So either this is confused and not a problem, or it's false because it's not true that they act like realists specifically. So in other words, if this is a claim that people act as if there are stance-independent moral facts, it's not true. Because what specify the behavior that there isn't any. If the claim is that they act like there are moral facts that are not stance-independently true, that's a trivial observation. That could be true of relativists, but it doesn't have any. So what? And it'd be a little weird to say emotivists and atheists act like relativists, and that's a problem. Like that would be weird. So this type of anti-realist acts like another type of anti-realist. So that's not really an objection that says, and therefore they're acting in a way inconsistent with anti-realism. They're just acting in a way inconsistent with a specific anti-realist view. Maybe they should go endorse relativism. That's not an objection that's going to get you realism or saying that people act like realists. So this is either toothless or wrong. This is and it's very frustrating. And I really don't like the insinuation that the people that endorse these metaethical positions are manipulators.
Use language in a realist way. So what the emotivist
okay, he immediately says in a realist way. Let's go back so you could hear the full context.
So what the emotivist is saying is all of these claims are all equally valid because they're all completely invalid. But we don't use our moral claims like they're all equally valid. This would be like convincing.
Hold on, let's go back a little.
Others are kind of always means to your end, as Alistair McIntyre says in After Virtue. Now, why is that?
Yeah, see, it's always using people as a means to an end. This is implying that when we use, if you're an emotivist or an error theorist, that you see other people as a means to an end. This isn't just false. This is not a nice way to describe other people. It's implying that the people themselves are bad people. This is not cool.
Is this? Well, because we tend to act as if our moral claims are true, and we use language in a realist way.
We use language in a realist way. No, we don't. So Thinking Christian, I'd be happy to have a discussion with you about this. I know we already had a conversation before. I wrote my entire dissertation on this topic, and I argue that it is not true. We do not have, I mean, we use language in a realist way. Okay, what's the evidence for that? What's the evidence for that? What's the argument for that? So you have your standard sort of philosophical armchair arguments, Frege-Geach problem, these sorts of things. I'd be happy to talk about those and why I don't think any of those are good arguments. In fact, I think they're all, I'm not even going to say terrible. I'm going to say they're garbage. They're really, really bad. You cannot establish how people use language from the armchair. How people use language is an empirical question. And the empirical evidence simply does not support that people use language like realists. Also, people use language like realists. Which people? Which ones? English speakers? Which specific English speakers? All of them? Okay, well, there are over 6,000 languages in the world. I think there's over 7,000 languages. And I usually use the more conservative lower number, but there's thousands of languages in the world. Do people speak like realists in all of them? Did you look? Did anyone look? You know, like this is a bizarre claim that people make. They'll just make this claim. If it's not an empirical claim, it's nonsense. Facts about how people use language are empirical claims. If it is an empirical claim, where's the evidence for this? Now, I've looked at the evidence for this. I've done some of the research on this. Unfortunately, I'm stuck only doing it in English. We do not have the cross-cultural data to support claims that people across 6,000 languages speak like realists. We do not have that data. People who make this claim are not justified in making this claim. Now, if you had 1,000 languages and they spoke like realists in 999 of them, fine. Go make your inductive inference that they speak like realists in most of them. I'll grant that. But people haven't done that. We've looked at, I don't even know how many languages, but not many. I do know there's been a little cross-cultural research. There's been research done in, let's see, China, Ecuador, Poland, Japan. And what do they find? They find actually pretty high rates of anti-realism in a lot of these places, or I should say anti-realist responses to the questions. I think a lot of these measures are probably not valid because I don't think that the participants in these studies are interpreting the questions as intended. But anyone that looks over the literature will see that the early studies, Goodwin and Darley, and some of the other studies had significant methodological shortcomings. That doesn't mean these were terrible studies. These are really cool studies, thoughtful, awesome. They used open response questions. They used multiple paradigms. A lot of these studies are really cool, but they had mistakes, which is not surprising for people making an initial foray into an empirical field and designing new paradigms. So all the credit to these studies. And I genuinely mean that these are really cool and fascinating studies. This is how I got into this stuff. I love this stuff. But those studies had methodological shortcomings. James Beebe, Jennifer Wright, Thomas Pulsler, myself, David Moss, a variety of people that work in this area, Ross Colebrook, have pointed out methodological shortcomings in this research and have worked, in the case of Pulsler and Wright, to correct for as many of the methodological shortcomings as they possibly can. And you have that work from Wright and Pulsler culminated in a couple papers that were published a few years ago. Can't remember off the top of my head. I've seen this paper so many times. I think it's 2020 or 2021. So just a few years ago. And the big paper is Anti-Realist Pluralism. And in that paper, Wright and Pulsler have I think 7 different paradigms. So 7 different ways of evaluating whether the participant endorses some type of realism or some type of anti-realism. They both have books on this topic on methodological shortcomings in the previous research. They do their best to minimize as many of those shortcomings as they can. They come up with new, more rigorous methods, and they subjected all of the participants to all of the paradigms. And what did they find? This was again, well, I say again because I've repeated this study many times, but they used participants, college students, and people from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, an online survey platform. I don't know if they specified that the participants were in the United States. So this is people in the United States, and what they found is across the 7 paradigms that the participants consistently favored anti-realism about 75% of the time, with a majority of those who gave the anti-realist responses favoring some type of relativism, whether it's individual subjectivism or cultural relativism. So what you have is the most rigorous study that was done found extremely high rates of consistent anti-realism among 2 US populations. Does that tell us everybody in the world is an anti-realist? No. Does it tell us 75% of Americans are anti-realist? No. Does it tell us most people in the world are anti-realists? It really doesn't. It tells us these 2 particular populations gave high anti-realist responses using these particular sets of stimuli. Does that have high generalizability? No, it really doesn't. But we look at some populations and we get high anti-realist rates. Pulsar has found similar findings, I believe, in research on Japanese participants. And there's other research. Taylor Davis has a pretty comprehensive paradigm, found very high rates of anti-realism across a variety of different moral issues. So Davis did it across John Haidt's 5 moral foundations, found high rates of anti-realist responses. In fact, I think the most common there was non-cognitivism there. So you have a bunch of research that gives this really mixed and equivocal data, but the best research and the most current research finds very high rates of anti-realism, at least in the United States and seemingly in some other cultures. So this claim that people speak like realists, okay, let's say all the studies are invalid and false. Okay, then we don't know whether people speak like realists. Like the best case scenario, we don't know. Worst case scenario, it kind of doesn't look like most people do speak like realists, at least in the United, like if you're going to generalize from those findings. I wouldn't. So just to give you an idea of how dedicated I am to not overgeneralizing from that data. The Polson Wright studies have 2 main populations, college students and online people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, presumably in the United States. Beebe and Sakris have a paper on meta-ethics. I think it's called like meta-ethics across the lifespan. And what they do is they look at people in different age groups. And people in their late teens through their 20s, in other words, the people most likely to be college students, undergraduate college students filling out these surveys. Doesn't mean they all were, but probably most of them. And they probably have the demographic data anyway. Those people are disproportionately likely to give anti-realist responses to meta-ethics questions compared to younger populations and older populations. So one sample from the Polson Wright study has a population that's more likely to give anti-realist responses. The other population, Amazon's Mechanical Turk participants in the United States, are disproportionately likely to be atheists or agnostics. You could look at Collier-Spruill et al.'s research with their relativism scale. Goodwin and Darley also have stuff on religiosity and meta-ethical views. And both of those studies find that atheism and agnosticism, unsurprisingly, are positively correlated with giving anti-realist or relativist responses to these sorts of questions. So Polson Wright used 2 sample populations. They sampled from 2 populations that are very likely, in fact, I wouldn't even say probably or maybe, I'd say very likely to be disproportionately disposed towards giving anti-realist responses relative to the rest of the US population and maybe to the rest of the world. It's hard to say, we don't know. So I'm serious when I say, I don't know if we could generalize from these studies. My guess, if I had to guess, is that the anti-realist response rates would not be higher for other populations, and that these are probably an overestimate if you're trying to generalize. So I really do think that. So maybe the real number is 60% or 40% or 30%, but it's not 2%. It's not going to be 2%. You're not going to get 2 or 1% of people giving anti-realist responses. This is not some weird negligible view that nobody thinks. And even for all the studies that have methodological shortcomings, they often have very high rates of anti-realist responses. You get weird stuff, like people giving anti-realist responses to some moral issues and realist responses to others. Some people have said, so those people are realists because they think there's at least some moral facts. It's more complicated than that. There's very few people in analytic philosophy that are relativists about some moral issues and realists about others. Usually they treat moral language as being uniform and determinate. And so these results are weird. And a flat-footed, crude interpretation of them is not the way to go. We need to figure out what's going on with the research, which is what I did. I went and sort of asked people, why did you answer the question this way? What did you think this question is asking you? Here's a response someone else gave. What do you think their response to this question means? And I tried to interpret how people were interpreting the questions. I was doing, you could say, meta-ethics research. I was studying how people think about meta-ethics. What I found is that people were consistently not interpreting these questions in the way that the researchers were intending. They weren't interpreting them as questions about realism and anti-realism. So a whole long story, but I concluded that people probably don't have views about these issues at all, any more than they have views about quantum mechanics or mathematical Platonism. So that's a whole lot to say that this claim that people speak like realists, it's just not, I don't think there's good armchair or a prioristic reasons for empirical reasons for thinking this is true. I think it's probably false.
So what the emotivist is saying is all of these claims are all equally valid because they're all completely invalid. But we don't use our moral claims like they're all equally valid. This would be like convincing somebody, hey, I like chocolate ice cream better than vanilla ice cream. This other person here likes vanilla ice cream, but I'm going to convince them to order chocolate ice cream because I personally...
It's not like that at all. So emotivists do not think all moral claims are equally valid. What is that? I mean, first of all, what does that mean? I hear critics say this a lot. If you're a relativist or emotivist or an atheist, you think all moral claims are equally valid. What do you mean by valid? What does that mean? It doesn't mean true. I mean, if you mean they think that they're all equally true, that's like saying, well, all equally good friends are the unicorn. Well, unicorns don't exist. So sure, there's a very trivial sense in which we're all equally good friends with unicorns, which is to say, not at all. So if by valid you mean true, then they don't think any of them are true. So yeah, they're all equally true, which is to say they're not true at all. And that's a very misleading and weird way to phrase it. If you mean that they're all equally like justified in acting in accordance with their standards or values, and a motivist does not think that, because justification doesn't apply. It's a kind of category mistake. People aren't justified or unjustified in acting in accordance with their emotions. It's just a matter of descriptive fact that when a person says murder is wrong, it means murder boo. And if another person thinks murder's okay, and they mean, when they say murder's okay, they mean murder yay. Those aren't equally like legitimate. Legitimacy doesn't apply. They're just telling you, yeah, this person boos at murder, this person hurrahs at murder. Done. There's no other implication or entailment. They don't have to think that if another person is like hooray murder, that they need to act in any particular way, and that they're not justified in stopping that person if that person tries to murder them or something like that. It just doesn't have these normative implications. And there's an implication here from Thinking Christian that there are these normative implications, and there simply are not. This is just not true.
Personally like it more. And this would be like their idea. Like, I personally don't like slavery. This other person finds slavery to be fine. Neither of these claims are any more valid than not, but I'm going to try to manipulate them because I can't.
Yeah, see, try to manipulate. Okay, so the emotivist is making a descriptive claim about how people use moral language. They use it to express their emotional states instead of making propositional claims. Now, if a person doesn't want to be mugged, like someone comes along and they're like, give me your wallet, and they don't want to be mugged. Hey, it's illegal to mug me. Please don't mug me. I have a family. I have to pay my bills. Is that manipulation? Okay, if we call it manipulation, then some manipulation, there's nothing wrong with it. If it's not manipulation, then the objection is wrong. So to try to label this, it's like trying to criticize the emotivist by using terms that have negative connotations, broadening their usage to include a whole bunch of stuff that isn't bad and isn't objectionable, and then saying, well, technically, this is a type of manipulation. And so the implication is emotivism is what? Bad or wrong or would lead to bad behavior? Like emotivists are doing bad things because they don't want people to murder them? It's ridiculous. This is not a good, I mean, I really mean that. I'm sorry to say this is ridiculous. This isn't just wrong. This is an awful objection. It's an objection by like linguistic gerrymandering of taking a term, manipulation, and then saying, well, technically, if you're trying to get people to do what you want, you're manipulating. Manipulation is bad, so this view is bad. This is not a good objection. It's not a good objection.
Can't be honest with them. If I'm honest with them, then I would basically.
So now you're not honest with them. So trying to get people to do what you want is dishonest? Why is it dishonest? So, I want to buy a car. Person wants to sell me the car for a higher price than I'm willing to pay, and I'm trying to convince them to sell it for a lower price. Is that dishonest? Why? Is all haggling dishonest? Is all bartering dishonest? Is all diplomacy dishonest? Is all persuasion dishonest? No, it's clearly not. This objection somehow manages to get worse because now it's implying emotivists are dishonest people. Notice what these objections are doing. Even if emotivists were dishonest people, would that mean demotivism was false? No. Again, though, the emotivist isn't just a person that's like, I am personally dedicated to using moral language to express my emotions. No, it's a semantic thesis that's saying, yeah, English speakers saying murder is wrong, they're expressing their emotions. It's not, why personalize it? Why is the emotivist the bad one if everyone talks this way? The emotivist is a view about how everyone talks, not how they themselves conduct themselves. And yet the implication here is that the emotivist is a sneaky, evil manipulator who's dishonest. This is dirty tactics for critiquing a view. It's implying that the proponents of the view are bad people. In a way, and it would be one thing if that were true, but irrelevant, which it is irrelevant to whether the view is true. So it's both irrelevant and it's false. So, and it's like, I got to say, this is kind of an unethical way of critiquing a view. I don't go around trying to argue, that if you believe in the Trinity, that makes you evil or you become a manipulator or something like that. I mean, one, because that's not true. And two, that's irrelevant to whether the Trinity is true or not. If belief in the Trinity or coherent or whatever, Trinity, like not the correct account of Christian God or something. So, you have, it's basically like more than wrong. It's like overdetermined in how wrong this is. It's like mega wrong. I don't know.
Be saying I can't give them a good reason to change their moral view, but I'm going to pretend like I can give them a reason because
emotivists and atheists can give people reasons. So, giving people reasons can involve appealing to that person's goals or values. So if I'm opposed to murder, and you're trying to murder me, and I say, hey, what if I give you money to not murder me? And you say, okay, and then you leave. I didn't give you a reason to not murder me, which is that you would rather have money than murder me. Like, none of that is inconsistent with emotivism. So emotivism doesn't deprive one of the ability to give reasons, or for an error theorist to give reasons, because there are anti-realist consistent construals of what those terms mean, that it's perfectly, available to an emotivist or an error theorist. So this is also just not accurately characterizing what conceptual and practical resources are available to an emotivist or an error theorist. Emotivists and error theorists are not unable to persuade people without lying, tricking, or manipulating. It's just not true. They can simply appeal. Like, if I'm an emotivist and I'm trying to buy a car and they want to sell the car for a higher price, I'm not manipulating them if I say, hey, there's a dent in the car and I think you're overpricing it. Maybe you didn't notice the dent before. And they go, oh yeah, you're right. Like, trying to talk someone into something, even when there's no, and the price of car is important because there's no objective fact of the matter about the price of the car. This is a question of us having disagreements in our goals or objectives. We have misaligned objectives, and attempting to persuade someone to give them reasons why they should bring the price down. There's nothing morally inappropriate about that. There's nothing practically misguided about that. There's nothing about that that requires realism. Persuasion can simply appeal to another person's goals or interests, and there doesn't have to be anything nefarious about it. If you're trying to convince your friend to go to a party, they're, oh, well, I want to stay home and study. You've studied a lot. You know you're going to do well in this exam. You know you're already getting an A in the class. There's no reason to be such a perfectionist. And actually, maybe since you've studied already, going to a party and having a good time, that could actually help you in the test, because it'll de-stress you. And actually, right now, your stress is a bigger problem than how much you've studied. Those are all attempts to appeal to that person's beliefs, attitudes, values, to convince them to do something in a way that may not be manipulative at all. They may go, yeah, you're right. Good point. You've made a good point, so I will change my course of behavior. Saying things to a person to convince them to change their course of behavior that informs the person or makes salient facts and considerations that are consistent with that person's goals or values is totally consistent with error theory and non-cognitivism and emotivism in particular, and is not in any way a nasty form of manipulation or tricking or dishonesty. I don't even know what to say, how misguided it is to act like, I keep saying act like, to present it in this way, because I'm assuming Thinking Christian really thinks these views result in some type of manipulation or deceit, and they just don't.
Personally don't like the way that they're acting or the way that they're treating other people. Emotivists, if they're being consistent, they shouldn't be using realist language when making moral claims, because they don't believe that moral language can function in a realist way.
They're not using it in a realist way. But I mean, this is especially misguided because emotivism is a view. First, I mean, think about how big the mistake is here. So Thinking Christian is saying we use moral language like a realist. The emotivist view is the view that that's not true. We don't use moral language like a realist. We use it to express non-propositional claims. We use it to express our emotions. And so the emotivist, when they're using moral language, is using it like they think people do, to express emotions. They're not using it to make propositional claims about what's objectively right or wrong. So how can you say that the emotivist, on their own view, shouldn't use the language like a realist, when part of the view is that we don't speak like realists, we speak like emotivists? It's a view about how we speak. I mean, this is weird. I mean, so it's like layers, and it's like an onion of error here. And it's frustrating.
And when an error theorist makes a kind of moral claim, all they're doing is uttering a statement that is false. So they're kind of being manipulative too. This is why
Again, it's not necessarily manipulative. So error theorists might be fictionalists and think that you should use moral language, even though you think it's technically false. You could argue that there's something insincere or inauthentic about that, and that might be true. But even if we go that far, that's specific to some error theorists that are that are fictionalists, and they're not abolitionists, and they're not revisionists about the language or anything. By abolitionist, I mean abolitionists about the moral language. Some actually favor that view. So you're talking about a subset of anti-realists that might be using language in a way that is, in a certain sense, insincere. Now, even in that case, for those particular people, and I'm not one of those people, and it's probably not most anti-realists or even most error theorists. Okay, so they use the language even though it's not technically true. Why is that manipulative? What's bad? What's wrong with that? Why is it bad to do that?
discourse under these two views.
So basically what I'm saying is insincere or inauthentic language isn't necessarily morally wrong or deceptive or manipulative. At least not in a way that's like objectionable. In other words, I'm saying just because they're using language that might be in some ways insincere, that doesn't necessarily make it morally bad for them to do that.
Views basically becomes coercion, because error theorists and emotivists still often use moral language in a sort of realist sense and brush their meta.
Yeah, so again, I just reject that they're using it in a realist sense. But even if they did, I don't think that that would be morally bad.
Under the rug. Whereas if they were straightforward with their meta-ethical views, they would have to admit, yeah, I can't actually give you a reason. Yeah, this isn't anything more than my own personal preference, but they don't.
So when a person is appealing to someone else, they don't have to say, hey, you shouldn't do this or you should do this because it's consistent or inconsistent with the objective normative facts. You could say, hey, you shouldn't do this because it doesn't get you what you want, or you should do this because it will get you what you want. So appeals to intersubjective or shared values are completely consistent with anti-realist views. You do not have to lie and manipulate to try to persuade people as an anti-realist.
But then again, I guess you could argue coercion isn't really strictly forbidden under emotivism or error theory. So I guess you could
notice the implication here that the coercion is bad. But think about what the error theorist or anti-realist is likely to be coercing people to be doing. They're going to coerce people to not lie, or not murder, or not rob banks, or the example before, not own human slaves. Does thinking Christian have a problem with someone saying, look, I don't think there's any objective moral truths, so I don't, but they still say that they're against owning slaves, so they're going to coerce people into not owning slaves. Is that objectionable? Because I don't think it's objectionable. I think that's a good thing. Yeah, you should coerce people into not owning slaves. That's a good thing. No one should own slaves. You should stop them. I mean, what would thinking Christian do if it turns out there's no objective moral truth? Stop caring if people own slaves? Because, again, think about it. There's no objective moral truths. Now you just don't care? I would still care even if there were no objective moral truths, which I don't think that there are. I would still be against owning slaves or torturing people or, whatever example of an atrocity or horrible thing that realists like to come up with to try to imply anti-realists are terrible, awful, evil people that are manipulative, deceptive, whatever. It's put the coercion in a context where, the anti-realist has exactly the same attitudes as the realist does. And notice something, realists coerce people too. And so again, they have the same attitude. So the anti-realist and the realist have exactly the same moral standards. One of them, it's all their attitudes. The other, it's their beliefs about what's objectively true, then inform their normative standards and their conduct accordingly. And so they both have exactly the same behavioral profile, and which involves what? Stopping people from murdering, stopping people from stealing, stopping people from bribery, stopping people from fraud. They do all the same things. It's just one does it because they're opposed to it on emotional grounds, and the other does it because they think that it's like they're objectively required to do so. They're both coercing people in exactly the same way. So how is this an objection to error theory or emotivism when they're both coercing people to do the same things? It's the same thing. What's the difference? There's no practical difference. This is a terrible objection.
Could argue being manipulative or deceptive is par for the course. And this is where we get into sort of moral nihilism, because all you get is this very Nietzschean will to power, using others as means to your...
You see, the implication is that if you're an error theorist or an emotivist, you can't or don't or wouldn't end up having the same attitudes and behavioral profile as the realist, that you'll transform into this like amoral or post-moral person. And it's this like Nietzschean dark thing where now you're out for what? Yourself? Like there's an implication here that these views lead to a change in your normative moral standards, your attitudes, and your behavior. What's the argument for that? What's the evidence for that? That's not a logical entailment of these positions. It's not entailed by them. Is there any evidence that it's true contingently? I don't think that there is. There's not any good evidence. So there's this attempt to show that anti-realists are bad people. And I think it just fails.
Your own end, trying to impose your own will on other people to get them to change their moral beliefs to be in line with your own. There's no idea of truth. It's just simply power and manipulation at this point. And I think this is the other point, right? It's begging the question for an emotivist or an error theorist to say there's anything somehow wrong with rape because it uses coercion or manipulation or power to convince someone to have sex with you, but then they're using coercion and power to sort of try and make this point, and there's no way to compare one being better or not than the other. And I think there's something deeply, deeply unsatisfactory about this. But I guess this is just sort of the reality of what happens if you take emotivism and error theory to their conclusion. Now, I want to talk about a few of the problems with moral relativism. The first problem is I don't really see how this even counts as truth, because when we're talking about truth, I'm thinking at least, we're talking about whether or not this is true independent of human thought. But let's suppose that that was solved. Let's look at some of the problems or some of the things that are unsatisfactory about moral relativism. James Rachels, in his influential paper, The Challenge of Cultural Relativism, claims that these are the following three problems with cultural relativism that eventually lead it to be false. And I'd argue rather, these are just issues that make it unsatisfactory. The first is that you can't say the customs of other societies are morally inferior to your own.
Oh my God. Yes, you can. Cultural relativists could say other people's moral. Yes, you can. You just can. So here we're seeing a basic failure to distinguish appraiser and agent relativism. If you're an agent cultural relativist in particular, so I'll just go over these. So agent relativism holds that the locus of moral evaluation are the standards of the person performing the action or the standards of that person's culture. That gives you individual and cultural agent relativism in particular. But you also have appraiser relativism. Appraiser relativism says that the locus of moral evaluation is whoever is expressing the moral judgment. And what that means is whether it's true or false, whether the statement is true or false, accords with the standards of the person making the judgment, not the person performing the action. And so then it could be true or false relative to the individual standards or the standards of the individual, the culture of the individual making the appraisal. And then you get appraiser individual and appraiser cultural relativism, respectively. So that's 4 types. You can put them in a little box and you could treat them as 2 orthogonal dimensions. So you have agent individual relativism, agent cultural relativism, appraiser individual relativism, and appraiser cultural relativism. This seems to be depicting only agent cultural relativism, which would hold that for any individual, when they make a moral, or when they go to do something, whether that action is right or wrong, turns on the standards of their culture. And this has implications for what you, as an outsider, have to think about that person and their actions. So if there's a member of a culture and in their culture it's okay to torture babies, then when that person goes and tortures a baby, you would have to think that it's morally permissible for that person to torture a baby, because whether or not it's permissible turns on the standards of that person's culture. It's consistent with the person's culture, so you have to be okay with them torturing babies. So it has implications for your conduct and how you evaluate that person. That is agent culture relativism. Who the hell endorses that? There's probably some people, but it's not a lot of people in academic meta-ethics. There's probably some people that endorse a view like that. But that leaves out, first of all, individual agent relativism, but it's leaving out the big issue, appraiser relativism. So an appraiser relativist would say that if someone says something, like let's take this member of this culture where it's okay to torture babies, and they go ahead and they say it's okay to torture babies, the appraiser relativist would say, okay, I don't agree with that statement. I think it's wrong to torture babies. And so whether or not when the person evaluating that, the member of that culture, says it's wrong to torture babies, whether when they say that it's true or false turns on their standards, not the standards of the person in that culture. You see the difference? Appraiser relativism is about the person evaluating the action, not the person performing the action. So that person in that culture, it's technically true for an appraiser relativist that if that person says it's okay for them to torture babies, when they say that, it's true. But what does that mean? What it means is that when that person says it's okay for them to torture babies, they're saying it's consistent with the standards of my culture to torture babies. And it is consistent with the standards of that person's culture to torture babies. So the statement, when that person makes it, it's okay to torture babies, is technically true. But it makes it sound like you have to think it's okay to torture babies. Now, let's switch this over to food and see how silly this gets if you start trying to have this agent relativistic approach. If another person says, I think pineapple on pizza is delicious, does that mean that you have to think pineapple on pizza is delicious? No, you could think whatever the hell you want about pineapple on pizza. It doesn't have any implications for what you have to do or how you have to think or whatever. Yeah, what that person likes pineapple on pizza. That doesn't mean you have to like pineapple on pizza. You might have to agree that that person, if they eat pineapple on pizza, they're having like a good time or they're doing what they want. But these are, again, descriptive claims. They don't restrict or demand anything of you. there's often a disanalogy between food preference claims and moral claims, because food preference claims, usually when people make them, they're making claims, at least this is my, take it with a grain of salt if you want, people are often just expressing something about their own conduct, and they don't care what other people like or prefer to eat. Sometimes people do actually get, people go, you don't like red wine? That's stupid. You're not sophisticated. So people actually do care about what other people like to eat. I think it's not true to act like people only care about their own preferences. People care about other people's preferences with respect to food and movies and music and that sort of thing. But with morality, we're often concerned not just with our own conduct, but with everybody's conduct, or at least a lot of other people or the people around us conduct, or specific people's conduct other than ourselves. And so we often have attitudes about or preferences about what other people do. And so that disanalogy can foster a lot of confusions. And that gets mixed into this jumble. But the bottom line is, a praiser cultural relativist would judge people by their culture standards. And they could judge members of other cultures as having morally worse standards because they're judging them relative to their own standards. And there is absolutely no problem or inconsistency or logical problem or, contradiction or anything like that. And so this is just, people frequently, when they describe relativism, they only focus on agent relativism and not appraiser relativism. I've talked about this before. It's super frustrating, because they should say specifically agent relativism. This is false. And it's misleading, because someone could always just say retroactively, well, I was just talking about agent relativism. Okay, then why did you say relativism? Why didn't you say agent relativism? If it has this radically horrible implication, or, in this case, an implication that people might see as objectionable, but the other form doesn't, why wouldn't you disambiguate and specify? Why set it up this way? I think most people set it up this way because they literally just don't know the distinction. They don't know the distinction. This is not my distinction. I didn't make it up. You could go look at I think it's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on moral relativism, and it draws the distinction. It actually says appraiser relativism is the more common of the two and will be used for the article unless otherwise specified. It says something like that. And so you can see, like, a lot of the mainstream discussion within analytic philosophy actually focuses on appraiser relativism, not agent relativism. And yet critics pretty much always focus on agent relativism. Why? Because it's easier to critique. And it's easier to give those shots below the belt. There's so much rhetoric behind this.
So Rachel's gives the example is when China is suppressing freedom of expression with Tiananmen Square, the way some cultures treat homosexuals. You don't get to condemn this anymore because that's a different culture, and you're not able to criticize another culture outside of your own.
Just to be clear, again, relativists can condemn the practices of other individuals and members of other cultures. They can condemn the practices of other cultures. There's just no inconsistency.
The second problem is you can't criticize your own society's moral code.
This one's a little more complicated, but this is only true if you're a cultural relativist. I don't know, like, if you're an agent culture relativist, yeah, maybe there would be some kind of inconsistency. This does pose some challenges for cultural relativists, but it doesn't pose any challenge for individual relativists. So there's that. So why the focus on cultural rather than individual or subjectivism? So you do have that. And then also, I don't know exactly how relativists have responded to this, but they probably have means of responding to this. This seems like it's depicting a fairly crude and flat-footed account of even cultural relativism. But I haven't recently read enough of how cultural relativists respond to this sort of thing to see what they would say. But my guess is that they would have pretty decent responses to this too.
Either. And Rachel's gives the example of a resident of India who wonders whether their country's caste system is morally correct. What Rachel says is all she has to do is ask whether this system conforms to her society's moral code. If it does, then there's no way it can be wrong. And lastly, there's no such thing as moral progress.
Yeah, so at least one thing, you cannot criticize your society's moral codes. Well, you could have attitudes, values, or standards that are inconsistent with your culture's standards. And so you could think something like, moral claims are used to express, it's again, this overly rigid semantic view of language where, okay, so like technically the semantics of ordinary moral claims are indexed to the culture, the standards of the culture that you're in or whatever. But that doesn't mean you can't say, okay, I understand that that's right according to my culture, and that just means that it is right. But then you could just disagree with what's right. Maybe if you're an agent relativist and you think that these moral facts are like binding or something like that, that could cause problems for you. Ironically, it would cause problems for you in ways that are actually make it more similar to realism than anti-realism. But let's say you grant, yeah, okay, so moral claims, as a matter of descriptive fact, they express the standards of one's culture. And so, if my culture thinks it's okay to do something bad, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to say, is it immoral relative to my culture? Because you already know the answer. No, it's not. But you can still, why couldn't you criticize? Does criticism require you to employ specifically the moral semantics of your language and culture? Can you not say, I understand it's right, but I like right according to my culture, but I don't like it and I don't want it to be that way? Is that impossible? You're not able to do that? So, even on a very surface level, it's just not clear to me why you couldn't criticize your own society's moral code. Why couldn't you? I don't even think that's explained.
I'll talk about this in a second. So Rachel's right from what he says. He says, look, we think that at least some social changes are for the better. For example, throughout most of Western history, the place of women in society was narrowly defined. Women could not hold property, they could not vote or hold political office, and they were under the almost absolute control of their husbands or fathers. Recently, much of this has changed, and most of us think of this as progress. But if cultural relativism is correct, can we legitimately view this as progress? Progress means replacing the old ways with new and improved ways. But by what standard can a cultural relativist judge the new ways as better?
Again, excessive focus on cultural relativism. Where's the individual relativism? Things can be judged as progress relative to a standard. In fact, we do this all the damn time. You can set a goal and then judge your progress relative to that goal. You can see something as improved relative to your attitudes or values. Oh, my friend's art got much better. Does that require you to think that there's objective facts about whether art is good or bad? No. They can improve relative standards are. The idea of progress is not inconsistent with progress relative to a standard. So this idea that relativists can't have progress is just nonsense. It's just nonsense. It's just not true. Unless you bake the notion of objectivity into your notion of progress, which, I hate to say it, but that's just begging the question. But it's really just baking your conclusion into your framework, and you're doing more linguistic gerrymandering. And, this is yet another issue where we already, people talk about how much progress they've made in a game. Hey, how much progress did you make in that game? Is that the result of progress that's not relative to your goals in the game or something like that, that you're objectively required to do these things in the game? No, these aren't stance independent facts about what you should or shouldn't do, what's right or wrong or good or bad. They're constructed standards. So you can make progress at getting better at chess. You can make progress at cooking. You can make progress. I've given enough examples. The point is, I'm not just trying to give a bunch of examples. I'm trying to say we're saturated in these examples of relativistic progress already. And so it's, again, puzzling that critics that will say, oh, a relativist about morality, you can't have progress, when they themselves probably already speak about progress with respect to personal goals or relativized frameworks.
And he continues, if the old ways conform to the standards of their time, then cultural relativists could not condemn them. After all, those old ways or traditions had their own time and place, and we should not judge them by our standards. Sexist 19th century society was a different society from the one we now inhabit. Thus, a cultural relativist could not regard the progress that women have made over the centuries as being real progress. After all, to speak of real progress is to make the sort of transcultural judgment that cultural relativism forbid.
Yeah, so it's more this word trickery, real progress. So real here means stance independent. If it doesn't mean that, I don't know what the hell they're talking about. If it does mean that, then they're saying, hey, if you don't think they're stance independent facts, then you can't have progress with respect to being more in accord with the stance independent facts. That's trivially true. What's the objection? What is the objection? So anti-realists can't have realist progress. We could call it that, realist progress. Yeah, they can't have realist progress. So what? Who cares? Why is that an objection? These objections, the objection might as well be, well, if you're a relativist, then you're not a realist. So that's the objection is that the anti-realist view is an anti-realist view. What the hell kind of objection is that? This is an awful objection. This is an awful objection. The objection to relativism is that it doesn't have a quality that presupposes realism. Ooh.
And Rachel's continues saying, look, to take another example, we all want to condemn slavery wherever it occurs, and we all believe that the widespread abolition of slavery in the Western world was a mark.
Yeah, and anti-realists, including relativists, can think and probably do think that that is progress. They just can and do think that. If you insist on your notion of progress, like it's in little parentheses, stance independent progress, then they don't think that. But that doesn't. You have to avoid normative entanglement here. What is the implication? That they're okay with slavery, that they're not as equally as opposed to as you are, because that's almost always going to be totally bullshit. It's not going to be true. So what are they implying? They're relativists. I mean, they'll do one of two things a lot of the times. They'll say, okay, well, look, if you really were a relativist, then you wouldn't think it was a good thing that we got rid of slavery, or that the widespread abolition of slavery in the Western world is a mark of progress. You wouldn't think that, and so the fact that you do think that means you're not really relativist. You're actually being inconsistent with your own principles or standards. So the first mistake is to think that you couldn't think that it's somehow inconsistent with the anti-realist views. It's not true. And the second is to say, well, because it's inconsistent with them, I'm not saying that that the anti-realist is okay with slavery. They know that they would say, I know you're not okay with it. And so really your attitudes and your behavior are inconsistent with your philosophical views. So you're just like totally engaged in performative inconsistency. I'm not saying, so it's like, look, the anti-realist, they couldn't consistently object to torturing babies. And I'm not saying they're okay with torturing babies, but because they're not okay with it, really, they're not actually an anti-realist. So it's like saying that we don't live like consistently with our principles. That's also a messed up accusation. I don't live inconsistently with my principles. I deny that there's an inconsistency. And so you have these structures and setups from realists where they're constantly insinuating that either the anti-realist of whatever the form is some evil manipulator. They're okay with torturing babies. They're okay with atrocities or whatever, or they're not okay with that, but they're just wallowing in contradiction and they're just a total idiot. It's just one or the other over and over and over.
Of human progress. Because cultural relativism disagrees, it cannot be correct. So this is Rachel's point. And once again, I think this shows what's so deeply unsatisfactory about cultural relativism. So it seems like moral realism would be the right answer, right? Well, not.
Why would that be the right answer? So let's say that agent cultural relativism had huge problems. What about appraiser culturalism? What about individual agent subjectivism? What about individual appraiser subjectivism? What about ideal observer theory? What about constructivist views? What about Humean constructivism? What about all the other anti-realist stance-dependent views that are not agent cultural relativism? Why pick one of them, and the one of them that even I would agree has the silliest and worst implications of any of them, and say, hey, this particular type of stance-dependent view out of like the 10 major ones has these silly and terrible implications, so I'm down to stance-dependent views. What about the other 9? I mean, I could go pick a silly conception theological view and say, like a Christian theological view. Let's say you think Calvinism is silly. And I sit here and I go, well, here's all these problems with Calvinism. Christianity refuted. Would you consider that satisfactory as a Christian apologist? I doubt it. So why think that if you could take down agent cultural relativism, you've refuted relativism or anti-realism in general? Like, what about my views? We already had a conversation. I don't endorse any of these views. So even if Thinking Christian had successfully just blasted every one of the views he's talked about into oblivion, that still wouldn't give you realism. And yet here we are. It's bizarre. It's like a false trichotomy.
Not so fast. The main problem with moral realism is that it's just tough to justify. And as we're going to see, it actually ends up contradicting atheism and naturalism more generally. The first is just there have been a ton of.
I think this is a good place to stop for today. So we're not quite halfway to the point in the video, but like to the halfway point in the video, but it's a good like shifting in topic. So maybe I'll return to this later today. I know it's MetaMonday, so if I do it like another day, it'll be a little weird. So maybe I'll do it today. Maybe I'll do it next week. But I think I give an enormous amount of content, 10 minutes, and I did an hour and a half. So I'm going to wrap it up there. So at least for the video. So I will stop sharing the video. And I will take a quick break. And if people have questions, comments, and that sort of thing, then I could do that. And I think I have to leave pretty soon anyway. So I've got about 10, 15 minutes at most. Otherwise, I'll close things out. But I'll wait a moment for people if they have comments in the stream, and I'll try to get to those. So I will be back in about 2 minutes. Okay, I am back. Oh, well, actually, one moment. I'll be back in like one. Okay, now I am back. So I don't see questions, and that's okay. What else can we talk about for a few minutes? All right. So what's going on? So I still have my blog is still going. I'm still doing the Twitter Tuesdays where I do commentary on stuff on Twitter. So one thing some people might say is, why do you focus a lot on what apologists say and what people on Twitter say and that sort of thing, and not cover as much of the academic stuff? Part of the reason for that is that this stuff is everywhere, and I think there's a huge interplay between academia and public discourse on these topics. And a big concern of mine is that that stuff bleeds into and influences all the people that potentially go and study these topics. So people that end up going to university, that acquire an interest in these topics, if they're sort of corrupted from the outset by the popular public discourse on the topic being just a total shit show and full of bad arguments, bad ideas, confusions, misrepresentation, a massive distorting influence on how these fields end up going. If you look at what's been happening in academic philosophy, I think there's huge, like academic philosophers don't talk that much to people in the public. There's thousands of philosophers. Almost none of them have YouTube channels. They're not on TikTok. They're not blogging. They are writing papers in academic journals. They're behind paywalls, and almost nobody ever reads them. And so that's stuff worth engaging with. I do engage with it. But it concerns me that that stuff is so insular and isolated from the rest of the world that there needs to be a battle on multiple fronts. So I haven't been as diligent in working on the academic stuff as I could, but I am working on it. And part of that is just, I just did a whole bunch of it, but there's much to do. So I can say some of my academic research is moving along. So I've got some stuff I'm working on free will right now, and I've got some other papers to get out there. So a lot of it is like a backlog of stuff that I've already done. So there'll be a lot coming out, academically speaking, probably in the next couple of years, mostly on meta ethics, but a bit on free will. I've planned out a couple papers on more, I guess you could say, like traditional meta ethics. That's less of the empirical stuff, but it's not. So I guess I should say like about 80% of it is like meta ethics, XFI type stuff, experimental philosophy, empirical stuff. So that's the big bulk of my research that I'm going to be putting out in academic stuff. I also have a little bit of stuff on free will. And then the other sort of new direction that I'm going to be taking some of it is in, I guess you could say, like sort of standard meta ethics. Like it's not as quite as empirical, although empirical stuff often plays a big role for me. And so those are the big things. So I am doing that work. But I also just, this stuff, I think it's just really satisfying. And I don't know. You know what? I don't know. Part of it, I guess something about the public discussion of meta ethics just got under my skin, and I'm really motivated to discuss it and to work on it. And you do see these remarks from academics. You do see hints of it. I'm not going to name names until I like say, oh, this specific person said this thing, or this specific person said that thing. But when I do stuff when it comes to academic work, I'm going to sit down and more carefully give you the quotes, give you the references, and say, here's what they're doing, and here's what I think the problems with what they're doing are. Because this normative entanglement and this sort of thing does emerge in the academic contexts. Not as frequently, not as explicitly, and not as crudely as it does in popular discussions. But it does emerge in those contexts. And it does emerge from professional philosophers. And so you will be seeing more examples. That was the thing I wanted to mention earlier. I'm also looking for more examples, and maybe I'll do a whole video on this or something, is I really want more examples. I want people that have heard me talk about normative entanglement, where people imply, and it's not just for meta ethics, where philosopher, basically I'm generalizing the concept of normative entanglement to not just be about meta ethics. And the general concept is that whenever a person, in critiquing another person, conflates the descriptive considerations of that person's view with non-descriptive considerations of that person's view, so as to imply that that person holds in virtue of holding these particular descriptive position, repugnant normative views or attitudes. So this, you're familiar with the meta-ethics example. You have a realist say to an anti-realist, hey, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? And if the anti-realist says no, the realist will like recoil and, clutch their pearls and go, oh my God, oh, you're evil. And it's like, they just think, no, it's not objectively wrong. They could still think it's wrong and have an attitude that it's bad and act just like the realist. But they'll act like the anti-realist has just said something horrible and monstrous. And this is nonsense. It's ridiculous. And I see people do this all the time. Well, I'll give a couple other examples. You've probably seen them too. Some people will critique illusionists about consciousness or eliminativists. Anybody that says, I don't think phenomenal consciousness exists. People say, oh, so you don't even think pain is real? That kind of thing. You don't even think animals are conscious? You don't think people matter? So people will leverage their skeptical views about certain philosophical views to imply normative views or bad attitudes or whatever. Free will. Oh, you don't believe in free will? Then you think we should let everybody out of prison. We should just let people do whatever they want. You don't think it's possible to love people. You don't think there's any good reason to praise anyone for what they do. Has all these horrible catastrophic implications. And again, just doesn't follow from disbelief in free will. So those are a couple other contexts. What I want people to do is be vigilant for philosophers and non-philosophers, lay people and professionals alike, implying that if you endorse a certain anti-realist or skeptical, or really any philosophical position, that this has implications, whether they be entailments or is strongly implied, that reflect badly on that person's character or doesn't really follow from them. Keep an eye out for that. I'd love to get examples of that. Again, I'll probably you could post comments on this video, but I really want to start aggregating these, because one of the things that could be really frustrating is when people say stuff like, nobody really does this or nobody really says this. Yes, they do. And I am going to eventually, I think probably on either a new website or on my blog, just post a big old list. Hopefully we'll get dozens, eventually hundreds of these. So if someone goes, nobody really says this, you go, here's the link, shut up. Yes, they did. So I really want that. All right. Anything else to talk about? I think that should do it. All right, everybody. So I will be back maybe later today, definitely later in the week. Tune in on Thursday. I think it's going to be in the evening. I forget what time for Joe Schmid for talking about graduate school and philosophy. What else do I have lined up? I'm going to be doing this. Hopefully, this will be the start of something awesome, doing this every Monday. I do have a Discord server. Join the Discord server. Like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I am now monetized. So if you want to send me awards like somebody did earlier, Saphir did, check it out. Shout out again. Thanks so much. It's been taking me months, but I'm still in the sort of planning phase for setting up. And now that I'm monetized, I could set up memberships on here. I haven't done that yet. I don't know if that's something people would be interested in, but I want to sort of revamp the Patreon so that I have cool membership tiers. I'm thinking of naming them after philosophers. I think Kane B already did this. I had some ideas, and then it looks like they're a lot of them are the same philosophers as Kane B, so I think I need to shuffle it around. Kane's probably okay with me using the same ones. I could even ask, and he'll probably say, yeah, go ahead. Because we like a lot of the same philosophers. The ones I'm thinking about are Hume, Nietzsche, Schiller, James. I don't know who else. If you have suggestions, let me know. Oh, right. Is that tomorrow? I thought you said so Democracy of the Dead says, Lance is hanging out with us tomorrow. One moment. Okay. Yeah. On the 20th. That's right. So this is going to be Wednesday, and my time, I think that's going to be 1:15 p.m. So, I got to make a thumbnail for that. So I'll have to get that set up. So, we're going to be talking, I think, did you look at my research and we're going to be talking about that? Because I don't know if I've talked about that a whole lot. So maybe I did months ago. I don't know. So I think we're talking about that. I'm not just going to be reviewing another video. So I got to talk on Wednesday. I got to talk on Thursday. And I've sent out a few questions requests for people to come on my channel. Some of them, it might be out of ways, but I'm still looking for people to come on the channel. So if you have any suggestions, feel free to make suggestions. Everybody always says I should talk to Mike Humer. So I'm going to have to do that sooner or later if my humor is willing to have a conversation. I am also really interested in different formats, you know? So like being on a panel or doing a kind of call-in thing, something like that. And yeah, Nitty, if you're still around, I just don't have time for you to come on and really talk because I got to go in like a minute. Oh yeah, so I did talk to Neil on Matthew Adelstein's channel. That's Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions, I think it's called, where we had a brief chat when I just joined the stream at one point because I went into the stream and I was like writing comments. I'm like, and they were like, do you want to just come up and talk? So we had a brief conversation. So maybe we'll have a chance to have a chat sometime. Okay, so Democracy Dead, we read all of your dissertation and watched almost all of your videos. Did you really? No one has read the whole thing. I know a couple people that did. That's wild. It's so long. Did you read the supplements? Because I think I have like 5 or 6 appendices. I have like 6 supplements. It's a monstrosity. It's a big. It took a lot of work. It took a lot of work. This is part of how my hair turned white, was writing that damn thing. I kept being told like, you don't need to write that much, but it was just I needed to purge all the thoughts over the past 10 years out of my system. So yeah, so we'll be talking about that. You read it recently. I wrote it, parts of it more than a year or 2 ago now. So I don't maybe you'll point things out I don't remember writing. Like, why did you say that? I'm like, I don't know. Why did I say that? I'm sure. And also when you write something of that length, there's gonna be mistakes. So I'm going to have typos. I'm going to have claims I don't even believe anymore. I'm going to have claims there's going to be problems. So we'll see. Cool. Okay. So that, I mean, we're going to, it's like, if you really want to cover that, we're not going to be able to cover it in one conversation. So I don't know if you're planning on us getting through the whole thing. We're going to have to make it a whole series or something. I'm not opposed to posting stuff that makes me feel better about myself. You're a very good writer, so it wasn't dry. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. There was, yeah. I don't know. That makes me feel good. Nothing wrong with that. So I was happy with how it turned out. A lot of my old essays and writing, I go back and read it and I'm like, oh, this is awful. But when I've gone back and looked at it, I'm like, yeah, okay. I mean, a lot of it was written in this kind of like coffee fugue. I don't know what to call it, where I would just like drink a bunch of caffeine and just be like on a keyboard for like hours. There were, yeah. Anyway, so I'm glad that's a good endorsement. If you do want to check it out, I'm sure you could find it. But I do have to get going now. So I'm glad that I had a chance to spend a few minutes where I wasn't just reviewing a video, but I will return to this video when I will be finishing it up. So you can look forward to that. You could look forward to my talk with Joe. You could look forward to my talk with Democracy of the Dead. What else? And then all the people that I'm inviting. And again, if you have recommendations for people you want me to talk to, do let me know. And some of the people I'm going to be inviting on to talk or discuss their work or whatever will be people that are people that have identified data fraud or are critical of the peer review process or other sorts of things. So I have this kind of meta academia interest as well. And I'm going to be pursuing that a bit. I'd also like to talk to more people about language. So I've been getting more interested in language cognition, language development. But anyway, I do have to go. So I will leave it there and see you all later. Please like the video. Please subscribe. Do all the things. And check out the stuff in the description of the video. I have a whole bunch of links to different stuff in there. Take care, everybody.